I'm a communications officer at IHEU, which is the International Humanist and Ethical Union. Maybe, can I ask, obviously lots of people here have probably been involved in humanism or the British Humanist Association and so on for a long time. I'll move it closer.
Yeah, that's better.
Yeah, it has a very limited range, I think. Okay. Can I ask who's heard of the International Humanist and Ethical Union before? That's quite good. Can you keep your hands up if you can also describe something that the IHEU does? Anything. So there's a couple of hands at the back and one over here. Well done. That's not too bad, that's quite good. So obviously the IHEU has been in existence for quite some time, but has a bit of a communications problem in that not everyone, including lots of people who are involved in local humanist groups or in the British Humanist Association, actually know what IHEU does. So they've identified that there's that communications problem and hired a communications officer, which is me. So that's part of my function, is to sort of communicate the work that's already being done by the IHEU to the wider world and make more of that work that's already been done. So that's fallen to me. I want to talk about a few things today. I'm going to talk briefly about IHEU itself and what we do. And I'm going to focus in on two elements of that, with a case study of me and doing some work in Uganda, and then another element of our work at the United Nations. So IHEU is the Global Federation of Humanist, Atheist, Rationalist, Secularist, Skeptic, Laïque, Ethical, Cultural and Freethought groups, which I think you can tell just by looking at it that that's not just a description made by a committee, but by an international committee. There's many words in it, including laïque, which basically means secularist in French, but it's a harder version of it. And those groups, that diagram there is showing that these groups affiliate up to IHEU as members. I might switch microphone. It's getting a lot of pops. We'll see if this is any better and doesn't pop as much. Yeah, that's a bit better, isn't it? All right, that's the planet Earth. You might recognise it. That little yellow dot that's disappeared is Amsterdam. That's where we were founded in 1952. We have registered offices in New York City, and currently a headquarters in London, and that's based at the BH office, which moved on Friday from Gower Street to Moorland Street, just south of Angel. So there are staff in the London office. There's me and Colin, the administrative officer, and there's some staff in India as well. We have an executive committee, and they're drawn up from the national member organisations usually. So they're elected by representatives from the member organisations, and they tend to be people who have a role in one of the member organisations. So, for example, Andrew Copson, who's been mentioned tonight, is our first vice president, and that tends to be the shape of things. They're sort of senior members of national organisations. There are representatives in Oceania, in East Africa, in North America, and we have an international director in India. And there are various committees, the Growth and Development Committee, the Grants Committee, that part of our work is sort of funding upcoming humanist groups and other projects, so that they decide where that goes. And we have representation at the United Nations, which I'll talk about later on. IHEU is the International Humanist and Ethical Youth Organisation, and they last year became a section of IHEU. There are 124 member organisations in 39 different countries. And you can see there's a few gaps there on the diagram. It's harder for us to get member organisations in Southeast Asia and in the Middle East and North Africa. In South America, though, things are changing more rapidly. We just sponsored the first Humanist and Secularist conference in Brazil in September. And there's quite a lot of new movements going on there. Argentina, Brazil are starting to sort of come online. That's a really long description of humanism, as given by IHEU. a democratic and ethical life stance that affirms that human beings have the right and responsibility to give meaning and shape to their own lives and so on. I think I'm going to pull out the bullet points there. But I'm not going to go into that too much because you're a humanist group and you already know what that is. I think one thing to pull out from that maybe is that sometimes democratic is not part of the way that people define humanism. It's something additional that they also think is good maybe, but not necessarily part of it. I think it's always been part of the structure of IHEU, where democratic member organisations is very sort of central to our understanding of humanism. And the last point there, that it's non-theistic and naturalistic. I think at an international scale, that one sometimes gives us sort of little problems, but by and large, the groups that want to join IHEU are completely on board with that. But sometimes you get this sort of question about why, and certainly it's IHEU's view that humanism it's not a coincidence, it's not arbitrary, there is something intrinsic about humanism, which means that it's non-religious, and it might include agnostics, but certainly the idea is that if you've already accepted that God is not the source of all morality, then it's a strange thing to hang on to after that point. This slide is originally part of this presentation grew out of a presentation for children. So you can see here a lovely diagram. This is moral responsibility coming from God or from political historicist ideology. I don't say that when it's children, or from some other ideology or idea, and that traditional idea that moral responsibility has to come from something else above or beyond. But in humanism, we think that moral responsibility comes from each other. There you go. I was just thinking that might help some of you. IHEU has various functions and does works in various ways. One is this helping groups grow with funding and training and direct assistance. We bring humanists together for conferences and networking, and I think that's actually a really important part of the work. It can seem a bit like ad hoc. It's like, oh, and we do some events, but certainly the Uganda Association that I'm going to talk about shortly wouldn't have existed at all if it weren't for a conference we held there in 2004. And we see that time and again that large events can spur people onto more activity, spur people on rather. We promote humanism through publications and our website. We represent humanism and our policy agenda at the United Nations, which again I'll talk about later. And we work towards a policy agenda as well through media, talks and other resources such as that. So it's a fairly diverse organisation in that way. So I'm going to talk about two of these functions in detail. The first of them, helping groups to grow with funding and training. So that's what we're moving on to now, Bob in Uganda. So before I used to work at the British Humanist Association, and when I left there I wrote to IHEU. So before I was staff there, like I'm staff now, but I wrote them a proposal, and I said, I see that one of the things you do is help member organisations to grow in developing countries, and I can see that you give grants and do training and work like that. I've just finished working at the British Humanist Association. Is there some role for me? Can I go and work on a placement of some kind? We obviously went back and forth about that and discussed it. And so after leaving the BHA, I ended up in Uganda with the Uganda Humanist Association, which you can see there in the middle of Africa, in East Africa, just off Lake Victoria. I put this slide in to show the size of Africa, and I know it's become almost a bit of a cliche, but you may not all be able to read the words on there, but the big brown blob is the United States, the big red blob is China and another part of China. There's Japan, India, Eastern Europe, Italy, Germany, France, Spain, the UK. It is a massive, massive continent, and that's almost become quite a cliche to say, and we lose sight of that. So any issues that there are for humanists to tackle are going to differ from place to place somewhat. But on the other hand, there is a fair amount of homogeneity. There's a lot of shared history across the continent, and here's one way of showing that. So here's Africa overlaid with the dominant religion by country. So you can see that the majority religion across the north is Islam, and in the south is Christianity, of course. Another thing to note from that diagram is how traditional religions, they're sort of hashed in on some of the countries. The slightly darker purple ones are where people are saying that traditional African religions are sort of existing alongside Christianity. And you can see it's a very small number of them. I think I've often heard people say, you know, traditional religion still exists in Africa alongside the religions. Actually, I think one of the things that falls out of this diagram, and certainly was my experience in Uganda, is that that's largely not true, that Christianity in sub-Saharan African countries has sort of wiped out. Certainly worldview level commitment to religion. There are animist beliefs, there are superstitions, but largely it's been displaced by Christianity. Oh yeah, that's where I was going to explain about me getting the role to go and work with Uganda Humanists. Here's a shot from Kampala. I just wanted to put a few pictures up. Again, originally for children, but I found that they helped just as much with everyone else as well. This is a typical street scene in Kampala. You can see that most of the buildings are pretty small. They do have power. Actually, one thing that's atypical about this is that there's no traffic on the road, and often Kampala is really, really full of traffic. There's lots of motorbikes around. You can see a few driving about there. Very dusty, limited open drainage there that often overflows when it rains really hard. A lot of the country are living much more remotely. Here's a rural village way up in the north of the country that I visited towards the end of the time there. These are bandas with the grass huts there. And these are still being built. In fact, this whole village was rebuilt within the last 10 years or so after Joseph Kony and the Lord's Resistance Army went through and destroyed everything in the area. So this village had to be rebuilt after it was burnt down. And here's more of a kind of town view. So this was in Tebi, this is where I live. This is actually the view from my own flat in this building. And most of the buildings weren't flats, they weren't that tall. You can see most of them were like one-story tin roofs, and it's a sort of symbol of middle-class achievement if you've got a compound wall around your building. And people couldn't believe that I was like, yeah, I'm from the UK, and they're like, what's your compound like? And I'm like, well, no, I don't have a compound. You wouldn't have a compound in the UK, but it's a real symbol of a sort of middle-class house to have that. That was some of the projects. And there's a wedding with lots of Indian influence on the saris that are being worn, I think, in Uganda. Oh, sorry. That's another slide for the children there. That is a picture of an African cat. I'm supposed to ask, do you know what an African cat is? And then that's my pet cat. Okay, here's a poster in Kampala that I saw. So we're going to come on now to talk about the issues that the humanists are trying to address in Uganda. This poster, The Light of New Hope, is from this guy who's packed out Nambuli Stadium. They have a big white kind of pillared faux Roman building in the middle of Kampala. It seems to have learned a lot from Scientology, this particular religion. This guy claims to be the new sort of messiah and to follow on from all the other religions. And it's quite new, it's called Happy Science. And obviously when I saw this, I just immediately thought, well, that looks really culty right off the bat. And I looked it up and went, yeah, definitely, very, very culty. And the people I was with when we started seeing these posters when we drove past this first one sort of said, well, you need to be open-minded, don't you? I mean, could be right. You've got to keep your options open. And I sort of said, well, he said, you're Christians, right? And he says he's the Messiah. I mean, you can't be that open-minded to that possibility as a Christian. And certainly, I mean, it's difficult for me to say, but certainly the humanists there identified one of the sort of major problems that they faced was the sort of the insufficiency of the critical thinking culture in the background population. That was their sort of way of talking about it, and they like to talk about critical thinking and skepticism, just like we do. And I think that's reasonable. In the same way that we often recognise that Britain's very cynical or we're quite sceptical, we're very quick to think things like, what do they really want? Why are they really saying that? What's this advert? Where does that really come from? In the same way that we can recognise an excess of scepticism, I think we can also recognise sometimes that there isn't as much in a given culture. And that's certainly what the humanists were trying to address in part of their work. One problem that comes out, maybe partly from that, and this is an element where a traditional belief has persisted or grown, although there's actually debate about whether the sacrificial murder of children has largely come about in sort of post-colonial times. But obviously, this is the magical. This is the idea that there is something magical to gain from murdering or dismembering children. Now, it's not obviously, the average family in Uganda has not had an issue with child sacrifice, but we are talking about hundreds of cases over every few-year period, and this is something that's on the increase. There was a British report a couple of years ago that looked into how often this was happening, and why it was happening, and then why the police couldn't do anything about it, and the discrepancy between police accounts of the problem of child sacrifice and the reality on the ground. And it's largely, it targets people in remote villages, maybe single women who have some children, and one of them disappears or is abducted and used for these magical purposes, and there's very little that she can do. She can't go to the police, she'd have to pay a bribe just to talk to them. Those are the kind of issues that they said were a problem with tracking it down. And it's a problem not just in Uganda and not just in sub-Saharan Africa. We see it in India and Pakistan as well, that people in remote rural villages have these beliefs in sorcery, and a really disturbingly common element of it is where they will dismember, in particular, a boy child, and bury body parts under building sites, for example. And the idea is that then the whole project, the business and everything that happens on that building site will from then on have some sort of magical bonus to it. That's the report I mentioned, the Jubilee campaign report. So the sacrificial murder of children is one really extreme example of how the belief in witchcraft works in Uganda, amongst especially rural places. But when I first put this presentation together, I went through and looked back at the last 2 weeks of stories that have come up on my media monitoring service for other witchcraft-related stories. So here's this is a tribal woman branded a witch and beaten up in Rajasthan. Some woman flees home. Couple branded witches forced to eat excreta and drink urine. So it's really horrific, kind of often very public and humiliating punishments to people accused of witchcraft. Nepal to crack down on witchcraft accusations. This guy was an Englishman in, I think it was Congo or Central Democratic Republic, maybe. I can't quite remember now. And he was found near a massacre site that had clearly been carried out as a sort of superstitious ritual, and rather than chase down the people who did it, this British guy got accused of that massacre. Alleged witch's husband vows to stand by her. Bahar woman lynched for practicing witchcraft. So that was just from a couple of weeks, and every day I get media monitoring reports too, and occasionally you get a case that isn't very different from the daily cases, but for some reason it picks up. So last week there was a case from Papua New Guinea. A woman was accused of witchcraft and burned alive in front of a group of people. Someone's nodding, saw that. And so sometimes these stories become bigger, but actually they're happening all the time. There's this background level of them. And I don't know, it's just like everything else. Sometimes stories that are happening all the time, something will pick up. I guess Papua New Guinea is not a place that it normally happens, maybe. So something pushes it over the edge and it becomes a media story. But they're very commonplace. This is a diagram used by the one of the projects in Uganda to demonstrate how this works. The guy on the right is a witch doctor, the guy on the left is I guess a victim of the witch doctor, and he's handing money, and the witch doctor says, "Thanks, now I'll do magic for you." So it's very much a service, a magical service, where you're handing over either money, cash, or maybe a goat to sacrifice, which then of course can be sold on as meat and be very profitable in that way. Lots of rituals involve, you have to buy silk, and then the ritual is performed over the silk. But doesn't get it dirty, and then the witch doctor can take it away afterwards and say, yeah, I have to burn this now for the magic to work, but actually they can keep the expensive silk and go and sell it on, for example. So people will give you money, and usually with the witch doctors, you're doing it for a magical service that's something like to win someone's heart, to give you wealth. Often the promise is just you will get wealth. There's no notion of where it's going to come from or how that's going to happen. You're just told, we'll do this ceremony and wealth will come to you. Or it might be to make your business succeed, something like that. Now the priests do this as well, and they're just as bad, if not worse. Certainly they're more numerous, and they probably take a greater percentage of an individual's wealth when they defraud them. I asked a pastor in Kampala, who I later found out was also a horrible homophobe, as most of the pastors are. But on this stuff, he was really good. On witchcraft, he was basically a humanist. He was saying, you know, this is awful. I hate that witch doctors and priests rip people off like this. And it was only after I'd done the interview and said to him, can you describe yourself, the bio line, so I've got something to describe you as? And he said, yes, I'm the president of the campaign against superstition or something. Oh, and I'm also the general secretary of the coalition against paedophilia, sexual perversion and homosexuality. And I was like, oh great, now I can't really use anything you said. But he rightly attacks this relationship, and certainly the humanists do. And it's sort of a well-known joke. Lots of the pastors will drive around big white 4x4 vehicles that they've got all this money, partly from foreign donors, just partly from the congregation, paying 10% of their earnings, for example, and they're told, we'll all pray for you, the church will bless you, and the worst thing about this is that whereas people tend to go to the witch doctors for worldly goods and achievements, they tend to go for the pastors more for healing. So if you live in an area with high HIV prevalence, the pastors are often saying, yeah, come to church and that will make it go away and you'll be better. So it's much more dangerous in that respect. One problem that the humanists also wanted to tackle was schooling. It can be very religiously instructive in the schools. There's lots of rote learning. Obviously there's national curriculum, so there's only so much you can do about this, but lots of the schools are private, and so they wanted to get into education, in particular to try and sort of defray some of the problems that are caused by the very, very prescriptive religious education curriculum that they have, to introduce more humanist ideas and to sort of change that culture and add some critical thinking in. Another problem that I've already alluded to is the problem of war, and there's no current war in Uganda, but the fallout from Kony and the Lord's Resistance Army that went through the north of the country is still very strongly felt, and one of the projects I'll talk about in a minute works in that area. So we've looked at this relationship between the witch doctors and the pastors and their victims. The first humanist project I'll talk about in detail is HAFREV. That's the Humanist Association, the Humanist AIDS Victims Rehabilitation Forum. And you can see there the HAFREV guy in the blue t-shirt is holding out a hand of pills, and he says, keep your money, you need to take these medicines and see the doctor. And there the witch doctor and the pastor are slinking away in the background. And that, in a nutshell, is what they do. That is their project. They run workshops and they find individuals who are clearly being defrauded, who may be sick and being defrauded. You can see the kind of area in which they're working. This is taken, I took this in Garuga right outside their headquarters, mud road, kids in the road, all the buildings are sort of made of wood and so on. It's a very literate area. Everyone is dependent one way or another on fishing around the shores of the lake. The HIV prevalence is through the roof, and people are going to witch doctors and pastors and thinking that that will cure them of their HIV, because that's what they're told it will do. So this project, through workshops and through direct counselling with individuals, is changing people around. One of their volunteers now is someone who was going to a church down the road, giving 10% of everything that he earned to the church, and they had to come and show him someone else that they'd used and that they'd counselled and said, look, this person was doing that. Then we took them to take antiretroviral drugs, and they'd been doing the church thing for a year and didn't get better. But now they've been taking the antiretrovirals, and you can see that their condition has improved remarkably. You need to do the same. And so once he'd done that, he then became a volunteer on their project. That's the team, and that's the headquarters there. But the organisation, that's one aspect, that's just one of the projects that is run by the Uganda Humanist Association. Here's a selection of leaders from the other projects that are being run. So that's very much its structure. There is a central association, but it's kind of a hook to hang all these different projects off. I've spoken about HAFREV, that's the AIDS Victims Rehabilitation Forum. There's also the schools, and lots of people have heard about the schools already. I know that you had a talk here a couple of years ago from the Uganda Humanist Schools Trust, and they've received a lot of support and funding from the UK by that trust, and from the trust is not part of IHEU, but IHEU have also given lots of money to them, and New Humanist as well. There are 3 schools with a 4th joining on to the network now. As I said, it's difficult to run a humanist school in Uganda. You have a lot of problems bootstrapping it out of the ground. Like, when you go and want to employ teachers, there's no ready pool of humanists to draw from to be your teachers, right? And you can only spend so much time and money doing the training, and there's a national curriculum. But what they're able to do, part of the way that they're humanist is that they're completely secular and open in the way that they bring children in. So the children are going to have parents from different backgrounds, Christian backgrounds, Muslim backgrounds, but they can all be side by side in these schools, which is quite unusual, the way that the schools are sort of privately run, usually by religious organisations. Then they can use the debate time. Actually, quite a lot of schools in Uganda have a sort of debate time set aside every week. But because the terms of the conversation can be quite limited, the humanist schools are able to kind of broaden that out and encourage people to say things that wouldn't be possible in lots of the other schools. HALEA is another of their projects. That's the Association for Leadership, Equality and Accountability. They kind of do a lot of the lobbying work for IHEU, so they're writing letters, they're lobbying on issues and running public debates, but they also go into schools and do workshops. So this has the advantage that they don't have to run a whole school in order to go in and run a confidence building workshop or a critical thinking workshop for days at a time. But it's not as sustainable as a school, of course. You have to pay every time you want to go in and give the teachers in the school a day off. You're sort of buying your way in. But they're able to kind of insert critical thinking, pro-human rights ideas and humanist ideas into a school without running the whole school. WAFWE does something similar. That's the Women and the Free World organisation. I know the acronym doesn't make any sense. I don't know why that happened. They specifically go in and work with girls in similar circumstances, and they've sort of targeted the Muslim schools in the north of the Kampala. And so they're working with girls who maybe, they've been told, you'll probably leave school when you're 15 and you'll get married or you'll already be pregnant. And they go in and do sex education, and they really have to convince their way into these schools sometimes, and they've met resistance from some of the parents. But they try and explain what they're trying to do. Like, there's a huge sort of cultural background notion in Uganda that people try and prey on children. And if you think the sort of tabloid paedophilia thing that we had a few years. I know Jimmy Savile's made it all seem really, really real, but that heightened scare about it is nothing here in comparison to there. People are deeply worried about it all the time. But the thing is, it is quite true as well. You see people hanging around outside schools. It's quite common for boda taxi drivers to try and give gifts to schoolgirls and stuff and groom them. So it's really hard to know and place exactly where the paranoia is and where there's a real social problem. And certainly, there's a high pregnancy rate, especially in vulnerable and poor areas. So they're targeting those girls specifically. They run football, which is actually a really important part of it. It's not just sort of, we're going to run football classes for the girls as a way of getting into the school. It's certainly they had this confidence that none of the other girls in the school had, because they got onto the team and they were doing the boys thing. Like, it was sort of laughable, the idea that girls could play sport and enjoy it and be good at it. So sort of breaking that taboo down was the sort of first step often. Kasese United is again part of IHEU. It almost functions more like a kind of like a local group does here, but they also run a school. That's the fourth school currently joining into the Humanist Schools network, and they have talks and meet in Kasese, which is in the west of the country. So that's more sort of pastoral and a community group. IHEU works in Kampala and in Gulu, and actually I think the Gulu branch has just sort of changed and become independent. But in Kampala they've been working with women who were doing sex work or at risk of doing sex work and doing vocational training to get them off the streets, and they run a couple of offices there where they're encouraging these women to do work that isn't sex work and running it like a little business and selling products that they make, administrative services and sewing machines, that sort of work. Which doesn't sound like much, but if you're coming from a situation where everything you've been doing is like the only source of your income could be sex work in high HIV prevalent areas where you're very, very vulnerable, then it can change things around massively. And so the Gulu project as well, which has just become independent of the IHEU, is called IHEU now. So in Gulu, that's in the north of the country, that's where they're working with the people who were left behind in internally displaced people camps. So the UN's done quite a good job of taking people out of those camps and the survivors essentially of that, it's not really a war, of that rampage that the LRA went on. They've managed to coordinate people back to specific villages so that they can form economies and function as villages and by consolidating people back. But you get people left behind, so they're often women who maybe an older brother has said that the family land that we're going to go back to now, having been displaced, is mine because I'm the man and I'm the brother. So the woman is just dispossessed and left out and told, what you need to do is go and get a husband and then you'll be fine. Or maybe both the parents have died and the girl was born on the camp, so there is no home to go back to. That doesn't really mean anything. She doesn't know where she's from. So they work with women like that who've been left behind on the camps. This particular woman was looking after 5 children, only one of which is her own child. The rest are actually her much younger siblings that the mother abandoned her with. So she had to look after them, and they were living in a tiny, awful room. The project, over a year, there's a sort of very, very structured program over the course of a year where they do training partly in language and writing, in confidence building, but also vocational training. They have sort of 2 streams. One is sort of clothes making, and one is agriculture, essentially sort of buying, trading and growing seeds and vegetable produce. She managed to save enough to build a banda, one of those huts, and then another member of the project came and joined her. So there's a sort of little village growing up that are beneficiaries of this project. Finally, there's a sort of nascent CFI Uganda, which just like here, the CFI Uganda is sort of attached to the National Association. But I think it's very nascent early. They're still trying to sort of work out what they're doing. And that's the kind of thing I was doing with IHEU. I was doing training, strategy and policy development, and actively building things that need to be done with them as part of that training. We had a big change of governance, and a lot of things were working towards their a general assembly for them, because they hadn't had one for a number of years, and they wanted to sort of change the structure of the association somewhat. Right, so that's one element of work that IHEU has done, is helping to develop a humanist association where there is a need. The Ugandans originally came to IHEU. They found out about us on the internet, and they actually invited IHEU to hold their General Assembly for that year in Kampala, which I think very bravely at the time IHEU said, yes, okay, we'll do that. And of course from that, a lot of the whole association really has developed, and all this subsequent funding and support from overseas. I'll move on to about IHEU at the UN then, which was the second of these roles that I wanted to talk about. So there are the places that we have some representation. I think there's a list here, yeah. So we have special consultative status in New York on the Religion or Belief Committee, Freedom of Religion or Belief Committee. Geneva on the Human Rights Council, the NGO Human Rights Council. In Vienna, we have general consultative status at UNICEF and the Council of Europe, and relations with UNESCO and observer status at the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. So there's quite a lot of work going on. But I'm going to focus on one specific topic, which is blasphemy, which has mainly been done through the Committee on Religion or Belief, but also the Human Rights Council in Geneva. So these delegations, they're experts. They're drawn sometimes from senior members of the national humanist associations, or they might be independent experts. A.C. Grayling was on our Geneva delegation for some time. And the work that they do